Good morning. My name is Grace Lingo, Executive Director of American Chamber of Commerce of Mexico, Monterrey Chapter, and I would like to welcome you to our webinar, How Will the US-China-Mexico Triangular Dynamic Evolve During the Biden Administration, co-hosted with Inter-American Dialogue. This webinar aims to explore the relationship between China, the United States, and Mexico. Some of the questions we are seeking to answer today are, what are the prospects for sustained growth in Chinese engagement with Mexico? In what areas are Chinese investors likely to focus post-pandemic? What factors will shape the US-Mexico dynamic in the coming months? And what effect, if any, will Biden's approach have on Chinese prospects, among others? If you have any questions during the session, please feel free to send them through the chat or the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen here in the Zoom. To start the webinar, I would like to introduce our guest speakers. Luis Rubio, Chairman of Mexico Evalúa, William Zarrett, Senior Counselor of the Cohen Group and Chairman of the American Chamber of Commerce in China, and Margaret Myers, Director of the Asia and Latin America Program for the Inter-American Dialogue, who will also be our moderator. Welcome, everyone, and welcome, Margaret.
Thank you so much, Grace, for the kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be partnering with the American Chamber of Commerce in Mexico on this event, and we'll certainly look forward to future collaboration. As some in our audience may have already noted, Alejandra Cuellar, one of our original speakers, is not able to join us today. She had a last-minute family emergency, so we wish her well and wish the best for her family. But we are extremely fortunate, as Grace mentioned, to be joined by two exceedingly well-known experts who will help us to understand the evolution of the China-Mexico-US triangular dynamic from really quite different perspectives. Both have very impressive and extensive bios beyond even what Grace mentioned, and you can access those on the Dialogue website or of course on their respective websites. And I won't go into much detail on each, but let me just extend, just as Grace has, a very warm welcome to Luis Rubio, Chairman of Mexico Evalúa, and of course, for those who don't know, Mexico Evalúa is a Mexican think tank that focuses on the evaluation and monitoring of government operations to improve policy and other outcomes. And William Zarrett, who was the former Minister for Commercial Affairs at the U.S. Embassy in China and currently serves also as senior advisor at the Cohen Group, among other important roles, which were mentioned by Grace. So welcome to you both, and thank you so much for sharing your time with us today. Since Alejandra, who follows the China-Mexico sort of relationship very closely, can't be with us, allow me to very briefly set the scene as concerns this one side of the triangular dynamic before turning to Luis and to Bill Zarrett for their remarks. I'd first of all simply say that the recent data and reporting on Chinese engagement with Mexico really seem to suggest something of an uptick in China-Mexico activity of late, especially in the area of foreign direct investment. Much has been made of China's fairly limited involvement in some of López Obrador's most emblematic projects, right, including the Tren Maya and the Dos Bocas refinery. China was sort of indirectly involved in the case of the latter through ICBC financing for Pemex. But a lot more than that is happening. According to some recent reports, 24 Chinese companies closed deals in 2019 and 12 in 2020. Huawei, for example, won a contract to build a fiber optic cable connecting Sinaloa and Baja California Sur in 2019. And China's ride-hailing service, Didi, right, which is already active as a ride-hailing service in Mexico, launched Didi Food also in 2019, which is a food service, delivery service, to obviously deliver in different parts of Mexico. In 2020, China State Power Investment Corporation, SPIC as it's well known, bought Zuma Energía, which is Mexico's largest independent renewable energy company. And of course, this is reminiscent of Chinese activity really, especially in the renewable sector across the Latin American and Caribbean region, and indeed globally. And in just the past couple of months, China's Ganfeng Lithium signed a joint venture for the Sonora Lithium project. As Enrique Dussel-Peters of Sechimex noted in a recent report, since 2017, Chile, Colombia, Mexico, and Peru have become the main recipients of Chinese overseas foreign direct investment in the Latin American and Caribbean region. Historically speaking, Brazil has had this top role for a number of years, right? So this really represents quite an important change in Chinese investment in a region, and perhaps, a refocusing, at least temporarily, on certain sectors and of course, just certain countries. And then on top of all of this, Mexico's foreign secretary noted in January that Mexico and China will possibly strengthen their strategic partnership in 2021. This could mean a number of things, including bilateral cooperation on vaccine provision, infrastructure development, or in any number of other areas. It may also suggest, and I hate to overuse this particular term, that China sees a sort of period of strategic opportunity at present, though, not without some likely challenges as the policy landscape in Mexico continues to evolve. It's important to, of course, put all of this activity into context, right? China's investment in Mexico has increased over the past 2 decades, certainly, but China is still not a main foreign investor in the country. As of 2020, China's FDI stock in Mexico accounted for just 0.23% of Mexico's total that year. And over the past 20 years, Chinese FDI flows to Mexico averaged about 66 million. That, of course, includes the period when China was not particularly active at all in terms of investment in the region, but nevertheless. US flows over the same period averaged about 13 billion each year. So there's really quite a discrepancy in that particular respect. The China-Mexico trade dynamic, right, is one that's typically painted in the literature as a historically contentious one. But I'd say that trade is also an increasingly important component of this relationship, and one in which we have seen some growth, right, both in absolute and also relative terms. In 2019, China actually overtook the US as the main exporter by value of machinery and electrical equipment and parts, much of that related to the automotive industry. All of these developments are, of course, taking place within the context of a rapidly evolving international environment, and for much of the more recent activity in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis. I think it's probably safe to say that China-Mexico relations will continue to grow in important ways, but the nature of that growth will depend on wide-ranging factors, including developments in the US-China relationship and the US-Mexico relationship, or the other two sides of this so-called triangular dynamic, and then also on domestic considerations in all three of these countries, as well as, considerations domestic and international in among a wide range of other actors. So with that said, let me go ahead and turn the floor to our esteemed panelists for some initial thoughts on how things might play out in the coming months and years, and on the numerous factors that may very well shape outcomes. And I'd like to turn first to Luis Rubio. The floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Margaret. Thanks to the dialogue and to the American Chamber of Commerce. It's a pleasure to be here today. I'd like to start by stating that what has changed in the Mexico-China relationship is not China, but Mexico. More important, there has been a significant change on the US side that has made this change possible. There are, in my view, two elements to this change, even if so far fairly small. One is Trump, the other is López Obrador. The question about the Mexico-China relationship in economic terms is not a new one. Many in Mexico and abroad have posed it quite often, sometimes thinking little about the implications. I'd like to address three main issues to place the question in context. First, the issue that this question is not new, but now it has strong political backing and everything to do with the US. Second, a key issue is what was Mexico's rationale in joining the world, as it were, 4 decades ago, and what has changed since. And third, the real issues involved in this relationship cannot be seen as bilateral, as Margaret just mentioned, because they fall into this peculiar China, US, Mexico triangle. The point of departure is both clear and illuminating. Beyond people who hate the neighborhood Mexico is in, a very small cadre of very ideologically driven, mostly intellectuals and academics, the issue for Mexico in the last 5 years has been how to replace the political function, let me repeat that, the political function that NAFTA was meant to provide. In the absence of the US as a credible factor of certainty that NAFTA provided, how can Mexico find its bearings and return to an even keel? The issue has to do with both the important function that NAFTA performed in Mexico's politics and economy, but also with the consequences of Trump's policies. So in sum, I do not foresee Mexico and China getting into a much deeper relationship beyond trade and relatively minor investments. But there is a very clear change in thrust in the bilateral relationship, which some previous Mexican administrations explored but never succeeded in advancing, as it is the case today. So first, the direction that China has been adopting goes hand in hand with the retraction of the US in the international arena, which has altered the cozy environment Mexico had enjoyed thanks to NAFTA for a couple of decades. China, with a keen eye on geopolitical realities, has largely avoided Mexico. Its investments in the country had been minor when compared to with the rest of Latin America. The few attempts in the recent past to participate in infrastructure projects had failed. Actually, most of them were thwarted by the US. Its only politically visible endeavors today are those like the one in the one segment of the Maya train and a small part of the new refinery. So there's no question that China has always recognized the geographic and geopolitical location and reality of Mexico. Yet, a few new recent moves by Chinese companies, as Margaret described, suggest a new environment. 3 circumstances have altered this context for Mexico. First, Trump's shenanigans vis-a-vis Mexico led to a new discussion about excessive concentration of trade with the US. Second, the risk of losing the centerpiece of Mexico's economic stability, NAFTA. And third, and critical, López Obrador sees closeness with China and somewhat with Russia as a useful electoral tool, as well as a means to begin to distance Mexico from what he sees as excessive closeness with and dependence from the US. I would even add the fourth. In contrast with the Obama administration, which made it very clear that Chinese investments in Mexico were unwelcome, Trump and now Biden have not focused on this at all. So the discussion about increasing ties with China and looking for alternatives to the US has been largely political as opposed to analytical reaction to Trump, which China has been willing to exploit, probably hoping for an eventual geopolitical realignment. The crucial point is, nonetheless, that Mexico's rationale has changed. Whereas a few attempts to involve Chinese investments by the previous Mexican administration, the Peña administration, like the Querétaro fast rail line and the Dragon Mart trading center in Cancun, were probably more related to corruption than to geopolitics, which China was willing to play along. The current thrust is conscious and US related. Certainly, Mexico imports merchandise in the dozens of billions of dollars from China, but its exports to China are minuscule. Yet investments in either direction remains fairly modest. More to the point, an important chunk of Chinese imports and parts and components go into exports to the US and Canada, mostly into automobiles and electronics. But the key is that regardless of what López Obrador or China might want, Mexico's welfare is completely tied to the American economy. In fact, from the early 1990s till the Trump era, Mexico's GDP and the index of US industrial production were a virtual mirror image. That has begun to change both due to Trump and lately due to the protectionist measures López Obrador has been enacting under the guise of self-sufficiency. So Mexico faces a significant conundrum looking forward. As I mentioned before, NAFTA was meant to be a source of certainty to investors. As such, it played its role perfectly, but it nonetheless produced some unintended consequences. First, it made it possible for Mexican politicians not to address the nation's ills, starting with the obvious issue of regional disparities that López Obrador exploited remorselessly and successfully in 2018. Second, it accentuated those disparities. And third, it produced rotten incentives, especially in that unchecked migration to the US eliminated the pressure to address structural problems, while the political and legal certainty that NAFTA embodied kept the economy going. So in this context, why change anything? It was Trump who changed the rules, thus bringing the China question to the fore. It was also the relative weakness of USMCA vis-a-vis NAFTA that has led to the collapse of private investment, both domestic and foreign. And then, of course, came López Obrador. López Obrador wants to recreate the 1970s. One of his components was a distant, often conflict-ridden relationship with the US. This is another topic, but the point is important. His vision of the future is ahistorical and devoid of reality, but it's nonetheless what he's pushing forth. The best example of the latter is the fact that neither Trump nor López Obrador could get rid of NAFTA, as much as they would have preferred. The forces of convergence proved too strong. So let me end with 2 points. What are the issues involved in the China question looking forward? Factually, Mexico is firmly anchored in the North American region, especially through the industrial supply chains. So beyond existing trends and given the limited goals of the Mexican government, I do not foresee concerted strategy to truly change existing patterns in the near future. Most important, in contrast with China's keen geopolitical eye on every action it takes, López Obrador has a much more limited aim, and that has to do with being left alone by the Americans, not leading an earth-shattering break like Cuba or Venezuela. In fact, the only way a strategy meant to really transform the China-Mexico relationship would succeed is if it were conceived within the relationship that Mexico has with the US. In other words, any future relationship would probably be within the US-Mexico-China triangle, which could easily be expanded depending on the way the US-China relationship itself evolves. It's quite obvious that Mexico could be a natural beneficiary of these investments in China, but the Mexican government is doing absolutely nothing to make this possible. So let me close by saying that the missing piece in this puzzle is the US government, which has been absent for 4 years now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Luis. Absolutely fascinating and much food for thought there. I hope it will generate a lot of questions, certainly has on my end. So please, if you do have questions, go ahead and stick those in the Q&A as we go along, and we'll address them as soon as the speakers have finished their initial commentary. Let's turn now to William Zaret. Is this a China issue or rather a Mexico issue and not a China issue, or China factors, but domestic or otherwise, playing into all of this?
You're mute.
Oh, you're on mute.
There we go. Thank you, Margaret. And thank you, Grace. Grace actually promoted me. I am no longer the chairman of the American Chamber of Commerce in China. I was. And if the present chair is watching today, I have to be very clear that I am not speaking on behalf of the American Chamber of Commerce today, but our comments, I'm sure, would be very similar anyway. And I wanted to thank you, Margaret, and thank the Chamber for organizing this and letting me participate. And from your comments and from Luis's comments, there's a lot of thought that's gone into this. And I hope that my comments will be helpful. I'm focusing on the US-China commercial relationship because that's basically what I know. And I hope it will be helpful. Bottom line up front, US biggest challenge, US business biggest challenge with China is the bilateral relationship. And I'd like to quickly frame that commercial relationship for you. Of course, it's commercial, but it also affects political, and political affects the commercial. I'd like to frame this in 3 sections. I want to focus on China's most recent 5-year plan, the recent US-China meeting in Alaska, and then just a few highlights from a recent business survey of US companies in China. First of all, the 14th 5-year plan. Of course, China has a planned economy, and the most recent 5-year plan, 2021 to 2025, is going to be especially important for the party, Communist Party, and for the leadership. 2021 will mark the 100th anniversary of the formation of the Chinese Communist Party. And 2022 will be the opportunity for China's General Secretary, Xi Jinping, to continue his leadership. And this would be unprecedented since the days of Mao Zedong, that the premier leader would be in office more than 2 terms. So this is very, very important 5-year plan. 2 of the key themes from this 5-year plan. One is technological self-reliance. And we've heard from China for many years about indigenous innovation. This is indigenous innovation on steroids and with a focus on technology. So this is just a continuation of a policy that we've seen for the last 10, 15 years. The other key theme is dual circulation. And simply put, it is for the Chinese economy to rely more on domestic demand and consumption rather than on international influences. The idea is to try to buffer the Chinese economy as much as possible from the vicissitudes of international business. It's called dual circulation because there is an international aspect to it. And that is, the Chinese want to continue to have high value exports to earn money, but also to continue to bring in foreign investment and foreign technology. You may have heard of Made in China 2025. This has been going on for the last 5, 6 years. Basically, it's a strategy to have China build champions in 10 industry sectors, which we see are present and future industry sectors, very important in world economy. And briefly, these sectors, and for those of you who are in these sectors, I'd like to highlight it for you. It's in information technology / semiconductors, robotics, new materials, new energy vehicles, and technologies related to rail, aviation, bio, agriculture, maritime. I don't think that's 10, but it pretty much covers the topics. Now, this Made in China 2025 piqued the interest of the West, and especially the US, so much because China is building these champions with the use of protectionism domestically, protecting these industries in China, and providing subsidies, preferential loans, building up these companies, and then taking these companies into the international marketplace. So it's really tantamount to having a company that is based on competition and market forces, a company competing against a country. So you won't hear China talking about Made in China 2025 so much anymore, but as the 5-year plan did show us, it's still alive and well. There's an annual work report which coincided with this 5-year plan, and the highlights, nothing surprising, 6% GDP growth. The Chinese need to create 11 million new jobs, according to this plan. And there's a focus on global warming. As you know, China is predicting that they will have carbon peaking in 2030 and carbon neutrality in 2060. Also a focus on healthcare, focus on poverty alleviation, actually a focus on things that governments should be focusing on for their people. At the same time as the 5-year plan was announced and the annual national work report is the annual 2 meetings of the major legislative and advisory bodies of China. And of course, this is also a lengthy list of things, but one that I want to point out is that one result is the overhaul of the Hong Kong electoral system, which basically takes away representative government from Hong Kong in abrogation of the agreement that China signed in 1997 to last for 50 years of the one country, 2 systems, which would give Hong Kong self-rule and gave it self-rule up until very recently. So that's coverage of the 5-year plan. A few words on the Alaska meeting between China and the US. The US prepared for this meeting, you will notice, by sending signals. One, we are working more with our allies. Luis pointed out very astutely that during the previous administration, we were America first, go it alone, etc. The Biden administration has a multilateral approach. And we showed that as Biden participated in the very first meeting of the leaders of the Quad. The Quad is the US, India, Japan, and Australia. Now the discussions were not focused on China. Actually, they talked about vaccinations for Asia, but the symbolism was not lost on China, for sure. Also, just prior to the Alaska meeting, Secretary of State Blinken, Secretary of Defense Austin met with their counterparts in Korea and Japan. And the topics, China, North Korea, and other issues, working together with allies. You may have noticed also the Department of Commerce put on some extra export control limits just before the meeting. The Treasury put on some sanctions on extra Chinese and Hong Kong officials for what's going on in Hong Kong just before the Alaska meeting. And what's been going on for the last 2 years, Congress has about 400 bills floating around the Hill that are related to China. In the meeting, both sides were clear on the baselines. China's baseline, they do not want an independent Taiwan. The US wants to stand by Taiwan. In Xinjiang, the labor camps are an internal issue according to the Chinese. The US calls it genocide. South China Sea, Chinese fields belongs to China. The US claims it's international waters, and Hong Kong, which we've just talked about, China calls an internal affair, and the US disagrees. Neither side budged on these baseline issues. Several things to note on the meeting. First, China has never been quite so frank about standing up to the US, at least verbally, as saying that the US is not qualified to criticize China because of all the problems we have in the US, which we do, but we try to deal with them on an open basis. The US was surprised by this diatribe from Yang Jiechi, who's the state counselor. Another point, aside from not agreeing on baseline issues, apparently behind closed doors, the US and China did talk about Iran, North Korea, global warming, world energy production, and other issues of possible cooperation. A third point is very interesting, and that is that economic issues, and most specifically phase one, the original agreement between the US and China, which we remember dealt with market access, intellectual property, forced technology transfer, subsidies, and oh yes, tariffs. This was not broached in the talks. So economic issues specifically were not talked about. The third part of trying to frame this commercial relationship, very briefly, I want to highlight some points that came out of a recent Amcham China 2021 Business Climate Survey. These are companies, US companies based in China. But I think it's quite telling that for these companies, China remains one of the top 3 global investment destinations for 2/3 of these companies. And the smallest number of respondents said that China's investment environment is deteriorating, turn around the other way. Since 2015, the environment seems to be improving for American investors. Having said that, about 1/3 of the companies will not expand investment in 2021. And 2 of the main reasons for that are market access barriers and uncertain Chinese policy environment. Not quite 20% of the companies are looking to either pick up stakes or more from China, or more likely to diversify their supply chains. So that is a big difference over the last 3-4 years. 2/3 of the companies are optimistic that China will further open its investment market in the next 3 years. And let me end where I started, with business challenges. Of the top 5 business challenges these companies face, rising tensions in US-China relations is the top one. And I will stop there and look forward to any questions that I may be able to address.
Thank you so much, Bill. So much to unpack there as well. Let me ask just really quickly a follow-up question for you, and then we'll ask a few more questions, including a great one that's in the Q&A right now. You talked about, China's own investment environment and concerns about, uncertainties, potentially policy-related changes, and just, existing and ongoing concerns about the challenges associated with investing in China in specific sectors. But what about the reverse? Where is China headed? Where is the Belt and Road headed? Do we see some concerns among Chinese companies, not just foreign companies, about the global investment environment looking ahead? Certainly the Latin American and Caribbean region, along with other regions, are going to be in a very difficult period coming out of COVID-19, both economically and potentially socially. Where are we? What is the feeling in China right now? And of course, I'm sure this varies considerably on a sector by sector basis, with perhaps some of those sectors that are being prioritized by the 5-year plan and by China's broader recovery efforts, having a bit more confidence as they go out. But do you have a sense of where things are headed with respect to the Belt and Road? Certainly, there's a lot of talk about promoting what will actually happen in practice.
Sure. The Belt and Road is a very, and I don't mean to be, it's a very clever policy, and it's a very interesting policy to reach out to originally the region around China to help develop the area for a number of reasons, to be a market, but also for political influence of China in those areas where China is investing and building up infrastructure and so forth. We've learned over the years also that BRI has evolved, and that recipient countries are looking much more carefully at these loans that China is providing and the terms and conditions, which are oftentimes quite predatory. We found it interesting that just about any investment or loans for development that China is making can be included in the Belt and Road Initiative. Originally, it was along the Silk Road, but now it really goes anywhere. I think one thing to remember is that China's pocketbook is not infinite. And China's economy is facing some very, very big challenges. For instance, debt, 300% debt, 300% of GDP. China is now facing a 300% debt. So I think that generosity in investment is diminishing with time for China. And we'll see more and more. Originally, BRI was helping to have Chinese companies go international, whether they're construction, whether they're telecommunication, other services, other technologies, to become world leaders in those industry sectors. And we talked about Made in China 2025. I think now such help will be more strategic for China's political ends. And I hope that I'm wrong, but as I see China wanting to gain influence in the region and in the Asia region, but also in other parts of the world, that such loans and funding will be more politically based, and in the interests of China's expanding power. So I think in terms of industry sectors, we can continue to look at Made in 2025, and reasons for these loans and funding will be more politically based.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting question. I think it'll be quite an interesting balancing act, right, for China. On the one hand, we see a really pretty rapid decline in Chinese finance to the region from the policy banks, but also an increase from commercial banks and targeted towards some of these very specific sectors that you mentioned in your presentation. So, you know, we may see some interesting focus, right? More of a focus in terms of investment as China grapples with some of these, supply side factors at home. And let me again encourage the audience. We have a great audience here still, so please do submit any questions through the Q&A. But before we turn to those, let me ask a question of Luis Rubio. Luis, you heard some of the sectors that China has prioritized as part of its sort of new infrastructure push, so-called new infrastructure push. Many of them innovation related, but traversing a number of different industries. You mentioned that, of course, much of the interest in engaging more extensively in this bilateral relationship is coming from the Mexico side, often for political reasons. And yet we see a lot of policy developments, especially in relation to some of the sectors that China's been prioritizing, that could cause problems for China, right? Or prevent more in the way of engagement. What is happening on the ground in terms of the policy environment, and will that be a problem not just for Chinese investors but for U.S. ones?
Mexico has an administration today that is 100%. There's some echo there. The administration is totally engaged in its own domestic interests, in its own political interests. It's not focusing on China. It is in a way using China or whatever else is available to send messages, to send signals to both the US and to the Mexican electorate in general, that it means to isolate itself from the rest of the world, that it means to advance the political interests of the administration rather than the development of the country. If China lends itself to participate in some of those ventures, it's more than welcome. It's not that it's trying to woo China or Russia, it's rather trying to send messages in the international arena to the US that it wants to diminish the level of the relationship. But it's, as I say, it's focused on domestic issues, on protecting domestic producers, on protecting domestic industry, on getting self-sufficiency, particularly in food production. Mexico has never had such a large trade balance in agriculture, and yet the government is pushing for self-sufficiency. Nonetheless, the point is that it is focused on domestic politics, not in development of any kind.
Terrific. Thank you so much.
And just
Yes, please go
following
ahead.
up on that, I find it so interesting hearing Luis's remarks that Mexico is in such a good position to leverage the competition between China and the US right now. And it's, well, we'll see what happens with the next election in Mexico, but it really could be very much to the benefit of Mexico, I would think, at least from this American's point of view.
That's obvious, but not to the government.
We have really excellent Q&A, so let me turn to some of those. First on Biden administration. Luis, a few of the points you made with, referenced Trump administration policy.
Margaret,
and the effects.
sorry, we're having trouble with your microphone. I guess it's making. Oh, you're better now. We can hear you better now.
Apologies. Yeah. Thank you so much, Grace. We there were a couple of excellent questions in the Q&A, and so I want to address some of those. But Luis, you had referenced in your comments, Trump administration policy and the effects of that and the response to that on the part of the Mexican government, and that much of this is perhaps driven from a political perspective. Much of this more recent engagement with China is, has been motivated by or in reaction to some of those policies. But now, of course, there's a new president in the U.S. and an interest, at least, in engaging more extensly. There are nevertheless a lot of predictions that the U.S.-Mexico relationship could be could face even more tension, and especially as concerns specific policy areas. But where is this headed? Do you see a bright side to this? Do you see a sort of reconciliation, at least in certain areas, or will there be continued efforts to at least diversify sort of these political relationships, as you've noted? And then Dudley Ankerson, just on a similar point, suggests that or mentions a comment that you made that the U.S. government impeded major Chinese infrastructure investment in Mexico during the Peña Nieto administration. If you have examples of that, that would be helpful to know, I think, for the audience. I know of a lot of corruption-related challenges, with specific projects, as you mentioned, the Querétaro train project and a couple of others. But if there are examples of U.S. impeding projects, that would be helpful for us all to understand. And do you expect that the Biden administration would do something similar? And that is perhaps a question for both Luis and William. So Luis, let me start with you.
I have two answers. It's sort of the same question. The big issue that Mexico's focusing, that the government is focusing on today, is trying to diminish the level of, or the closeness with, the US economy and the US administration. The recent meeting between President Biden and President López Obrador went much better than either, I think, expected, and that may allay some of those issues. Nonetheless, what López Obrador is trying the message he's trying to send is very clear. He wants to draw a line in the river along the border and telling the Americans not to intervene. In that sense, the relationship between Trump and López Obrador was perfect, because the last thing Trump wanted was to intervene in Mexico. He wanted something from Mexico and he got them, and that was the end of it. No more than that. The broader answer, I think, is much more complex for the Mexican government to grapple with. And let me use a metaphor. Mexico is, in a way, sort of very similar to Australia in opposite directions. Australia is a solid member of the West. It's a member of the Five Eyes group. It's an Anglo country in every regard. And yet its balance sheet, its economy, is totally linked to China. Mexico is not an Anglo country, it's not a Western country, but its economy is totally linked with the US. So the question is, when push comes to shove, what will happen? Australia is demonstrating today that it's willing or trying to stave off pressures from China, and is paying harshly for that. Time will tell whether it can sustain that pressure. Mexico does not have the ambitions of China. Mexico has a very inward-looking administration, trying to keep the Americans out out the door, mostly in political areas where it doesn't want the Americans to intervene. My sense, and I'll defer to Bill, my sense is that President Biden eventually will start sending messages that is unacceptable. But there are some fundamental problems that the American administration is dealing with at this point that probably limit its interest or capacity to deal with Mexico. Eventually, I'm sure it will.
Thank you, Luis. William?
Yeah, in terms of the Biden administration, am I echoing too? No, okay. In terms of the Biden administration, looking at China, and this will also affect Mexico. The Biden administration is so focused now on the domestic economy and the pandemic, and Luis intimated that the administration is busy with other things right now, and even China has taken a back seat. But what we're hearing from the president and from his cabinet people is that the US is going to have, as I mentioned, a multilateral approach. And we've seen a number of examples of that, as Luis mentioned with the Five Eyes, but also the Quad. And now, unfortunately, with the issues in Xinjiang, it's a terrible issue, but we've seen coalescing of the EU, the UK, the US, and Canada around making official statements that are protesting what is going on in Xinjiang. So I think the US will be focusing on its allies. And rather than confrontative, which actually the Trump administration had quite a confrontative policy with China, I think what the Biden administration is going to do is have extreme competition with China. And that really is different. Areas where we can work together, global warming, for instance, we will try to do that. And rather than confronting China and attacking China, there will be much more focus on getting America's act together through infrastructure, through education, through R&D. So it's a very different focus than we saw in the former administration. And to the extent of the US trying to keep or somehow prevent Chinese investment in Mexico, I think the big issue right now is Huawei. And to the extent that Huawei is running, or Mexico is running Huawei equipment on its telecommunication network, that will be an issue with this administration.
Thank you, William. That's very interesting. I think we're all wondering how much pressure Biden administration will put on countries with respect to 5G, whether it'll be similar to the sort of approach that Trump took in Brazil and indeed in Ecuador, right? Or if we'll see something a little different or different approach.
It seems to me, Margaret, like we have to have a carrot and stick here. Rather, I think just a carrot, because yes, we don't want you to be using that equipment, but what is the US going to do for us if we don't use that equipment? And I think that has, at least publicly, that's been missing from the discussion.
It's a tough sell from a messaging perspective, certainly on the US side. But let me there's a question from Dulce Pereira in the in the Q&A for Luis. And Luis, you had mentioned on Mexico at least is using, and perhaps I misinterpreted this, its closeness with China is something of an electoral tool. I wonder if you could clarify that. The question specifically is, do you believe the China-Mexico relationship will be a theme to be included in Mexico's next election?
It's not so much that as that the president is trying to use any means, any instrument to attract the people. He's in a very 1960s, 1970s mentality. He believes that if he goes against the Americans, he can draw attention and support from the electorate. That in a country where more than 55% of the people have a direct relative living in the US, I don't believe will work. That's nothing, bearing no resemblance to what existed in the 1970s. Today, most Mexicans have some direct relative there. So, but he's trying to exploit that at that angle, and using China for that purpose is part of his toolbox. Whether it works or not, June 6th will tell us.
Thank you so much. Another question on nearshoring. This has been a topic, sort of throughout the pandemic, really, with a lot of discussion at the beginning of the pandemic about nearshoring and reshoring of production. What is the discussion right now in Mexico about this? Are we seeing much progress? The coverage has died down somewhat in the media here in the U.S. and it seems, also internationally, but there are still efforts, and certainly the IDB, under the leadership of Mauricio Clavacarone, has continues to promote this idea. Will we see more of an effort to do this? Will it be, what role will the U.S. play? And indeed, perhaps for William, the question is, are we seeing much interest on the part of U.S. companies that are, invested in operating in China and perhaps relocating their supply, or changing somewhat their production? Let's start with William.
The short answer is that there is no discussion in Mexico. There are lots of opinion leaders calling for, or business leaders calling for action, because it's such an obvious and great opportunity. But there is nothing being done by the government to attract those companies. In fact, the government has dismantled every institution that was created to attract or to make life easier for companies moving into Mexico. So there is nothing being done along those lines.
Thank you, Luis. William, any thoughts on the matter?
We've been dealing with this reshoring for a while. Most specifically when the tariffs went in, and the idea was to be an incentive for American companies. Part of the reason for the tariffs was an incentive for American companies to reshore. And it wasn't terribly effective. In surveys we've done over the last 4 or 5 years at the American Chamber in China, single-digit percentages of companies would be either picking up stakes or not expanding their investment in manufacturing in China. But for the most part, companies continue to do business as usual. The big change, however, and this seems to me could be a positive effect for Mexico, is the supply chains that US companies relied on so heavily in China and realized that they are at risk, whether it's US action on tariffs, whether it's a Chinese action for political or other reasons that would cut off a supply chain. I think that American companies, I was going to say, have learned their lesson. They're learning their lesson. Our Japanese friends in China for years have diversified their supply chains because they understand the situation. They're much more realistic than US companies had been. So I think the statistic was 17% of companies are either moving, not reinvesting, or diversifying supply chains. And that number has actually grown in the last 4 or 5 years.
Thank you so much. That's very interesting. But a few questions here from Angel Rocco about, where we're likely to see more in the way of Chinese engagement, what specific sectors in Mexico in the coming years. And indeed, William, you identified a few that have been prioritized both in top policy documents and also, with respect to China's own efforts, to revitalize its economy and to promote domestic investment at home, which will eventually traverse China's borders. But the question is, first of all, what are the areas in Mexico, where China might have extensive interest, but also, should Mexico worry about investment in any of those sectors? Certainly there is, there's been a lot of discussion between Mexican and US officials about this particular point. A lot of talk from the Trump administration in particular about, the various threats associated with Chinese investment. Is this something that Mexicans ought to be worried about, or should they be actively promoting more in the way of investment in growth promoting sectors in particular in their country?
How about if I answer
Luis,
yes?
Oh, yeah, go ahead, William.
Yes to
Whoever
both.
liked to
Yes, they need to be somewhat concerned. No, yes, they need to continue to promote. I think that makes infinite sense to promote foreign investment, whether it's Chinese, whether it's American, whether it's other investment, because we know that usually ends up being a stimulus for jobs and for economic growth and so forth. And at the same time, to be very clear-eyed about the investment, what industry it is in. Is this investment going to take over the Mexican industry in that area and push out Mexican companies? Are there other possible nefarious reasons for this investment? To a lesser or greater extent, the Chinese Communist Party does have an influence on foreign investment. Yes, there are a lot of private companies, but remember, in order for Chinese private companies or SOEs to invest overseas outside of China, they need to get approval from the government for anything over $50,000. So in other words, they have to get Chinese approval, which tends to mean that they're looking for investments in these certain industry sectors where China wants to be the champion. So these are all factors that need to be taken into consideration. But I think that our Mexican friends should continue to look at Chinese potential investments.
Thank you so much, William. Yeah, and I think we have about 1 or 2 minutes left, so I'll give the last word to Luis.
Thank you, Margaret. Mexicans have always historically been wary of the US. It's the big power to the north. But since NAFTA, most Mexicans came to realize that and to see the US as part of the solution, not as part of the problem. In fact, implicitly Mexicans, or de facto Mexicans, began to see the geopolitical reality where Mexico is located. It's not explicit, but all politicians now realize that Americans have a stake and have an interest in Mexico's success and accept that. The exception is López Obrador, not because he's incapable of seeing that, but because he lives in a different world. He lives in the 1960s and 1970s. So the real question is what happens when the American administration begins to exert pressure on Mexico on Chinese or other matters. How will the president react then? And that's I think the important question. My guess is that he'll cave in, just like he caved in to Trump in the past few years, but he's not going to go the easy way. He's going to make a lot of noise along those lines. The problem is that he doesn't understand the rationale for investors in the 21st century. that they have options and that they will take options. If Mexico is not willing to accept them, then they will go somewhere else. And that is something that the current Mexican government simply does not fathom.
Thank you so much. Well, on that note, thank you both so much for your time and your extremely illuminating remarks. I think I have even more questions now than when I started, just simply because this is such an expansive topic with so many angles to cover. I hope that we'll have a chance to engage in a discussion of this sort again. And thank you to our terrific audience for the really excellent questions. Thank you. We're very grateful for your participation in this discussion. Grace,
Thanks for the opportunity.
Yes. Thank you, Margaret, Luis, William. And William, thank you for clarifying my imprecision in your introduction.
Thank you for the promotion.
You're very welcome. Thank you to the three of you. And on behalf of the Amcham Mexico Monterrey chapter and the Inter-American Dialogue, we thank you for joining us today. Please receive these virtual recognitions in gratitude for your participation this morning. And thank you to all the attendees for joining us this morning. Well, at the end of this session, you will receive a small satisfaction survey. We ask you to support by filling it out so that we can learn from your experience at this event. And the QR on your screen can also take you to the survey. Thank you everyone, and we'll see you at our next webinar.
Thank you. Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.